Hello, welcome back to these Uncanny Oddities. So tonight, I'm just going full freeform, and I'm going to talk about some interesting theories that I've recently had that I've been working on. Some that I've recently have had, and some that I've been working on. Let me fix my camera. Let's see. Woo. All right, that's good. Now, some theories I've recently had is I've been thinking a lot, since we've been doing our episodes on biomedical engineering. And what if I told you that we might already have the tools to end all known human diseases right now, and it's not science fiction? Like, I've actually been working on some theories and doing some research and studying up on stuff. And as strange as this might sound, I actually believe scientifically that, dare I say it, I believe that scientific immortality might actually be a possibility, like through the proper research and tools. I feel like we are very, very close to actual scientific immortality. But of course, it'll never be available to the public, only the politicians and the rich. But for me to explain these theories properly, there is some other stuff that I have to explain first, such as we briefly went over we went over a little bit on CRISPR on our last episode. So let me dig back into that a little bit deeper. So what is CRISPR? It is a genetic scalpel, like when doctors open up your body for surgery, they have to cut you open with the scalpel, and then it's very precise. But that's what I mean by saying it's a scalpel. I'm trying to say that it's very precise. Okay. And what it does is essentially it will allow people to modify their DNA and their genome, like they're in their actual human genome. It can now be modified through the use of CRISPR. And I got some articles here to help me explain it a little bit better. So let me pull some of these articles up real quick to help me better explain CRISPR. So let me see, where is it? Here we go. Share screen. All right, got it right here. So CRISPR, where did it come from? Now, as I said, it's kind of similar to a computer program. When you go in like a text document and you copy and paste, or, you go into a computer program and you delete something and it's just gone. And then you can like copy something from here and paste it into there, like, pasting text from one document to another. Or when you're modifying computer code, like if you're a computer programmer or something like that, one, well, I'll use that metaphor here in a minute because that's going to be important. But it's like, if you need to put zeros and ones, like binary code, but this is with DNA. So I think it's A, C, T, and G are the letters. And essentially what CRISPR does is it actually allows people to go into their own personal genome and take these different letters and stuff, and they can basically take an A, cut that out, and replace it with a T or whatever. And essentially what that allows people to do is it allows them to modify their DNA at its core, which would theoretically allow you to let me think about how to word this. It would essentially allow you to modify your DNA to copy and paste from any other creature into your DNA. But of course, there are problems with that. Like when you're doing coding or accounting or something like that, if you put a 0 instead of a 1, or you put a comma where you meant to put a period, one little tiny, teeny tiny mistake, one keystroke is all it takes to completely ruin an entire website of coding, or one little number that's wrong, even by accident. The tiniest little, put a V instead of a B, or a 1 instead of a 2, whatever, a 0 instead of a 9, because they're right next to each other on the keyboard. But like, you make the tiniest little mistake, it can break an entire website, or even weeks and weeks, sometimes even months worth of accounting. Like, that's very important, because if you make a mistake with CRISPR, you can get a disease known that I'm going to call Dancer, so I can avoid the censor. But I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. I'm learning to speak like an alchemist, so I like to use it whenever I can. It's a fun new skill I've acquired. But that's besides the point. So where did CRISPR come from? This was something that I was thinking about, and I realized that I didn't actually know. So I decided to look it up, and this says CRISPR systems evolved to defend bacteria against bacterial viruses called phages. Well, that sounds familiar. Like, the macrophagy is part of your immune system that helps, distribute information to all the other cells, telling them how to fight, like, your white blood cells and your killer T cells. Now, learning how phages infect bacteria and how those bacteria use CRISPR and other defenses to fight back. And this says that there is another more general term known as prokaryotes, but bacteria is more likely to be familiar with common people like me or you. Now, right here, it says the phage life cycle, how phages infect bacteria and spread. So the infection starts off right here. Looks like they have some, little things. I guess those are probably the phages around what I'm guessing is the cell. And then replication, it looks like they use the cell to replicate themselves so they can move on. And when they finish off with one cell, they go to start destroying another cell. So it is a virus that infects bacteria. Oh, those are bacteria cells. Okay. Deep in the ocean, in our own gut, and everywhere in between, phages are infecting all sorts of bacteria. Even though they're invisible to the naked eye, phages are actually the most abundant lifelike form on Earth. We say lifelike because they do not meet the criteria to be considered living organisms. Just as human cells use DNA as instructions for their function, phages carry around DNA or RNA genomes as blueprints. So DNA genomes are known as RNA, as blueprints for their assembly and spread. However, phages cannot reproduce on their own. They must take resources from bacteria during the process of infection and use those resources to produce more phages. This is why they are only lifelike. So there's talking about the infection process, but I think we get the basic idea from here. So we're going to close that out. That's enough of that. I think we get the basic idea from here. So it is essentially infecting the cells, sorry, not cells, infecting the bacteria. And as a result, it basically hitches a ride into your body through a viral infection. But once it gets into your body, the RNA, the blueprint, tells it how to react. So naturally, out in the real world, it's probably not going to be a very fun experience. But if you have certain blueprints that tell it to go to, oh, I don't know, the DEC2 gene, DEC2, the short sleeper phenome gene, and turn that on, then you only need to sleep 2 or 3 hours a day. You could easily operate on 2 to 5 hours of sleep a day if you have activated the DEC2 gene. Now, there's other genes that we will be discussing later on. Well, as much as we can safely discuss. But we'll get to that in a minute. So the next thing I wanted to mention, I think I've, hit CRISPR. I think we've gone far more than detailed enough this time, and including what we did last time. And we've gone over the idea of cutting and pasting genes, the importance of guide RNA to tell it how to operate. But, and this, before we get into the other side of it here in a minute, there is the possibility of human upgrades, not just fixes, but upgrades. Like like Rob mentioned on our last episode about the bionic arm and stuff like that. But my idea with CRISPR is more about deeper upgrades, which I'll get more into detail later on, but just to give you a little teaser of what's to come. There is science to support the idea, only in theory, that we could use CRISPR technology in order to take certain traits or characteristics from other animals and incorporate them within our own DNA. Such as, well, honestly, I think the camouflage aspect of the octopus is like one of the coolest things we've ever seen in the animal kingdom. So, like, I think it would be really cool if we could make a human do that. But even with CRISPR technology, I unfortunately have to admit I've actually looked into this one personally on a deep level. And as excited as I get about CRISPR, I do have to admit there are limits. And unfortunately, octopus happens to be one of those limits. But it's for a very interesting reason. Humans, hold on. Let me look this up so I get the right information, if you'll bear with me for just a moment, because it is a very specific number. Okay, so octopuses versus humans in terms of genes, right? Humans have approximately 20 to 25,000 genes. All right? And CRISPR technology is still in its infancy. We have to admit that. It's still early on. So, it's not like we already know every single 20,000 to 25,000 of the human genes. Oh, wait. Actually, we do. We completed the sequencing of the human genome uh back in 2004, I believe it was. But yeah, we actually did complete the sequencing of the human genome, and that information was gained by Ancestry, which was bought out by Blackstone. Not BlackRock, the Illuminati company, but Blackstone, who originated the Illuminati company. And since Blackstone is typically in the housing and business market, it's very interesting why they would want access to all that DNA unless there was something darker going on behind the scenes that we're currently unaware of. But that's a side tangent. Anyways, so octopuses, okay? They have 33,000 genes. That is about 10,000 more genes than humans have. So, yeah, that alone makes it next to impossible to use an octopus in any sort of CRISPR experimentation because they have like 10,000 more genes than we do. And not only that, but their genes, like, I don't know exactly how to say this, but they just function differently than humans do. not to mention they have 10,000 more genes, they also function differently. And just trying to take a gene from an octopus and putting it into a human would almost assuredly give you Dancer. And, you might feel like a ballerina, but it's not going to end well. Let's just say that. So we can't do octopus. Dang it. I wanted octo camo in real life. But there are some other candidates we're going to discuss later in more detail. I'll briefly mention now, but we'll discuss them later in more detail, such as the immortal jellyfish, the axolotl, and the Greenland shark. And they have certain genes that I have research notes on. And remember earlier when I said there were certain genes that I couldn't mention for my own safety? I'm sorry. I'll give you as much details as I can, though, and you can do your own research. And I'll even help you find out where to start with that research. But unfortunately, the exact genes themselves are hidden somewhere within about 880 pages of notes. So I have them somewhere. I do have them somewhere, but they're hidden deeply. And even if I did have access to them, it would be incredibly dangerous for me to share that information, to be completely honest. So I'm trying to guide you towards that information. I have access to resources, OSINT, open source intelligence. I've been talking about that a lot lately. But even still, some open source intelligence information can brush up against black ops, highly classified documents. And if you say too much, it won't. Let's just stop there. So what I wanted to mention, as I've been very excited to mention these creatures that I've been talking about the last few minutes, these are my visionary concepts of how I believe we could give humans scientific immortality. And it's not a science fiction plot. We have already isolated these genes as a species, as humanity. I fully 100% believe that we have already isolated these genes, and I do believe that they're doing experiments with super soldiers, and I should probably stop there. But to get some more details about these creatures that I've been talking about, the immortal jellyfish goes through its life. It starts off living deep down in the ocean. It grows up, and eventually it goes through normal stages like any normal jellyfish would. And eventually, when the jellyfish gets near the end of its life cycle, it goes back deeper down into the ocean again and just decides, you know what? I've had enough of this. And it starts just anti-aging itself back down to a baby again, all the way back down to a little polyp. And it has the free will to choose consciously when to reverse its own aging process. And if you want to do your research and tie it down to the exact individual gene that correlates to the skill of reverting its aging, which I have isolated that gene, but I'm not going to mention it. But that information is out there. It is open source intelligence. I want you to go out there and I want you to see if you can isolate the genes for these creatures, which I'm about to discuss, including the immortal jellyfish. Because I believe if we can isolate these genes in someone with the proper biomedical knowledge and the proper CRISPR knowledge, well, I'll leave the rest up to your imagination. So there is another creature known as an axolotl, and it can actually regrow limbs and even parts of its brain. So like you chop off its arm, 3 hours later, it's got a new arm. Okay, Deadpool, Wolverine, the Incredible Hulk, all these, superheroes that seem to be able to regenerate lost limbs and, heal from cuts in a matter of seconds and regenerate lost limbs in just like, a matter of hours or whatever. Well, believe it or not, all of that stuff is based on a real life creature known as the axolotl. Okay, I don't know if it's directly based on that creature. Probably not. But there is actually a real life creature in the real world that has regenerative capabilities that can rival that of the Incredible Hulk, Wolverine, and Deadpool, amongst other, fictional superheroes. And not only can it regrow limbs and even parts of its brain, so like legit, you could literally shoot this thing in the skull and it could come back and just regenerate its brain. But not only that, it does all this with no scarring, no scar tissue, and no scarring. None at all. Like it's amazing. Now, before we move on to the next one, I wanted to inject a little bonus one that I get really excited about. Tardigrades. If you wanted to create invincibility in a scientific manner, then you would definitely want to study the tardigrades. There are these little creatures known as tardigrades, and long story short, they're legitimately invincible. They have done everything they can, and as far as I know, unless you know something I don't, and if you do know something I don't, please tell me, because I would be very, very curious to know how to kill these things. Because from what I've researched, humanity has no idea how to even cause harm to tardigrades. They've tried burning them, like attacking them with, flames, like swords, they've tried cutting them, everything. And so far as I am aware, humans do not have any idea how to hurt these things. We have even gone so far as to send tardigrades into outer space with no protective gear. And not only did they survive in outer space, and I'm not talking about like in a spaceship or in a rocket. No, just like I'm here right now. Hi. They're in outer space like this. Just what? And not only did they survive, they were able to reproduce while in outer space. Like, these things are literally invincible, as far as I'm aware. So if you could isolate the gene from those creatures that gives them that telomere resistance like that, you could theoretically use CRISPR to inject it into a human. And that's also why you would want to find the Greenland shark, which lives 400 years or longer and barely ages. So let me lay this out for you. If you have the proper biomedical knowledge of both humans and these particular creatures, there's a very good chance that you could isolate the gene of the immortal jellyfish that lets it revert back to a polyp stage, the axolotl that gives it regenerative abilities that don't leave scars, and the gene for the Greenland shark that allows it to live over 400 years and barely age. I think I've discovered Count Saint Germain. It's time to bring him back, guys. We're bringing back Count Saint Germain. It's a 1 episode special, and he's back because you know what? He had access to CRISPR. I'm taking it full tinfoil hat time. I'm making this up on the spot as I'm talking. So, my new theory, Count Saint Germain, Fulcanelli, all the ancient alchemists that, lived for hundreds of years, Nicholas Flamel, all them, they somehow, in their own way, not literally CRISPR, but somehow in their own way, through the use of alchemy, they were able to find access to something very similar to these genes. And they were able to do something absolutely amazing. They didn't need the CRISPR technology, they didn't need the science. They were able to use philosophy, spiritualism, and alchemy to change their very genetic structure to activate certain genes to allow them to have those abilities. And the very fact that a Greenland shark can live up to 400 years, an immortal jellyfish can revert to a polyp stage, and the axolotl can regrow limbs and even parts of its brain with no scarring, just goes to show those things are possible. And what do humans love more than anything? Experimentation. So, continuing on, there is a risk of dancer and chaos. Now, this is the thing. We've been talking about editing our DNA, but here's the issue. When you edit the DNA, that CRISPR, as I've been doing this a lot, that's because CRISPR is an injection. It's an injection, okay, like a shot. And what that means, what that's doing, is you're injecting these cells, genes, however you want to look at it, you're injecting them into your body from an external source. So the very first thing that happens is your immune system goes wild. Your immune system thinks it's being attacked because essentially it is. And this is where it gets dangerous. It's like an organ transplant. The body can potentially deny an organ transplant because the immune system might see it as a foreign threat and reject it. So that's always a possibility. Hey, James, good to see you. I've not been paying attention. I apologize. Good to see you, James. Man was not given eternal life. Find out what was going on before the flood. Ooh, actually, now that you mention it, I will interrupt myself to go on a rant about that. Because I actually have been studying up on some of that recently. Methuselah, they say Methuselah lived for, what was it, like 900 years? And they say, people used to be taller and live a lot longer. Well, what if that was actually good to see you too, James. What if that was actually part of the reason that man was punished? What if that was part of the punishment is if after the flood, God modified our genes or our DNA to make us not live as long and not be as tall as punishment for our sins? That's actually one I've been working on for a while now. So, as I've been saying here, though, a lot of this stuff is incredibly dangerous because it could, your immune system could see it as a foreign invader or an attacker, just like, an organ transplant. Now, another thing is CRISPR could accidentally remove a tumor suppressor gene or something else important like that. CRISPR might remove the gene that allows you to sleep. The DEC2 gene is the short sleeper gene, but I don't know which gene it is that allows you to sleep or stay awake or whatever. everything in our body is controlled by a gene, and I unfortunately don't know all 20,000 of our genes off the top of my head. I apologize. But the DEC2 is the gene that is like the short sleeper phenome. And if, editing your stem cells could cause cascading mutations and all sorts of bad stuff. So that's why this is incredibly dangerous. And that's why the CRISPR babies in China, the He Zhuangqi incident, caused so much outrage, even though honestly, I didn't really understand what the issue was, because he was just trying to cure a deadly disease in a child, and from what I could tell, it actually worked. So where's the harm done in that, you know? It's getting further from Adam's perfect DNA, degrading. Ooh, yes, that actually does make sense that you would say it was degrading, because that's actually what life is. From the very moment that we're born, we start degrading. It's in actual scientific terms, they do have an actual name for it. I think it's uh telomere. Something with telomere. Because I actually have been studying a lot on, this CRISPR stuff, and, how our genes work and a lot of that. I have, even though I don't know everything and I know hardly anything at all, I do feel like I've been spending a lot of time studying up on a lot of this stuff. So the next thing I'm going to go through is, the idea I had after that was, what if, because there's so many dangers and risks to CRISPR, just, making the injection. So what if we only had to make one injection, a nanobot injection? Now here's my idea. We're shifting gears from CRISPR into nanotech, all right? So what if instead of editing the genome directly, through that, what if instead of doing it directly and having to go in every single time we wanted to change something, add another injection and go through the danger all over again every single time? What if we added nanobots who could scan our bodies from the inside out? And here's what we do, okay? We all know nanobots are called nano because they're tiny, right? So the nanobots could be as tiny as our cells, okay? And my idea is that these nanobots would be armed with the genetic blueprints and disease libraries of the entire human genome, which we have sequenced out, by the way. So basically, what I'm suggesting is we incorporate all human knowledge of diseases into the nanobots, and we give the nanobots the ability to recognize, tag, and fix bad DNA, all without surgery. It's like you do have to get a shot, because it would be an injection, but it would be one shot and you would be good for the rest of your life. You would never have to get anything else, just that one shot, and it would protect you for the rest of your life. And I hope you're having a better night now, James. I hope we can give you a good distraction tonight. So, with the nanobots, they could actually work together with your immune system. I watched an anime called Cells at Work, and now I think I know a lot about my immune system, okay? Jeez. It was like the Japanese version of Osmosis Jones, okay? It was freaking sweet, as Peter would say. So it could train your killer T cells and work together to feed the, all the disease information that we're going to inject into the nanobots. It could actually feed that information directly to the macrophage, which will in turn train and instruct the killer T cells, which are like, steroid hyped up rah, 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 versions of your normal white blood cells. They're like, if your normal white blood cells are the police or the cops, then the killer T cells would be the military, the army, something like that. The heavy duty stuff, And so the macrophages would get the information from the nanobots, and they would tell the killer T cells exactly what they need to do to help you fight off each individual disease or infection. and this would augment your healing and defense mechanisms, and it would bolster your immune system to a point where you would eventually become human 2.0. And if you tie it all together, oh, hold on. So if nanobots are in you, who controls them, you or the designer of them? That is a very, very good question, James. And in my theory, I would be the one in charge of injecting myself with nanobots. My idea is honestly self-experimentation. I'm not even going to lie about it. Specifically because I believe self-experimentation to be the most moral and ethical way to handle something like this that is, unventured, unbroken ground type stuff. And obviously, I'm not going to do this anytime soon. This is like a far, far out in the future plan. But the idea is that whoever would happen to do this, obviously, for this to work properly, would have to do self-experimentation, because on the one hand, you could have people sign up as volunteers, but that's still tricky, like, what if they're, I don't know how else to say this, not trying to be mean, but what if they're just flat out not good people? Okay. And then you got not nice people running around with this kind of stuff. So we would need to make sure that this information is only preferably known by those who need to know it in medical fields. And we would want people to have some sort of interview to prove their character, a resonance test, if you would, to try and feel out and discover who the bad people are and who the good people are. And personally, I would not want this to go to bad people. But that's kind of a tricky morally ethical dilemma. There is who decides who's good and who's bad. So that is a very good question, James. Who's in charge of the nanobots, you or the designer of them? Well, here's my theory, is that it would have to start off as self-experimentation. So in this practice, you would be the designer of the nanobots, in my theory. But I also understand what you're asking, and if it was going to be like rolled out by a corporation, I would want it to be rolled out by a corporation that is known for being ethical and moral and a good corporation. And honestly, I don't know if such a thing even exists right now. But if not to sound too egotistical, but I like to think that I have, I know I'm not the best person, but I like to think that I have decent morals, and I feel like I have a strong sense of justice and right and wrong. And I have been thinking about a lot of these companies, and I'm getting sick and tired of the way that they're treating people and the way they're treating people's data and privacy. And I want to form my own company that will respect people's data and privacy. But I'm not trying to, you know, promote myself right here. It's something that I've been considering, because that's a very good point that you bring up, is how can we trust a company? Because we've already, I don't know the exact details, but we've already had a case where someone had a neural implant and the company went bankrupt, and they literally revoked that person's neural implant, and let's just say it didn't end well. I actually need to look deeper into that, because that actually sounded like a pretty interesting story. But my point being that we need an ethical and moral company that we can trust to respect people, their data, and their privacy, because, that's one of my biggest concerns. James actually brought up a very good point here. Who controls the nanobots? You or the designer? And in the terms of nanobots, that could be a very big deal, because they run through your bloodstream, and at any time, a corporation could just turn the nanobots into assassins. And there's nothing you could do about it. Like the Neuralink that Elon Musk is, trying to push out and, get so hyped up and all this. You know, I can understand why some people would want that to help, with degenerative diseases and, blindness. I heard they're working on trying to cure blindness with that. And, some of the medical stuff sounds really interesting and really good for the world. And I love that. And I mean, I love the idea of just being able to download a language into my brain in like 5 minutes and just speak a new language. That would be amazing. Being able to learn information, but like just by downloading it into your brain like that. That'd be amazing. But with every good thing, there's a trade off. And the risk outweighs the benefit in my mind as of right now. Not and here's another thing. A lot of people are like, technology is bad. A lot of people think technology is bad because people get hacked all the time and people lose their data. And that's true. But once again, it goes back to a problem of having bad companies with bad morals that don't care about personal data or privacy. And it's the companies and the people that are the issue. The people running these companies are the issue, not the technology itself. That's one thing I want to stress to people is a lot of the stuff that we see that's so evil and, so bad with technology, we have to think about it logically. Do we dislike what's happening with this technology because the technology exists? Or do we dislike what's happening with the technology because of the way the technology is being used? Because I think far more often, if we actually stop and ask ourselves that question, I think far more often it will be we have a problem with how the technology is being used, such as how the NSA likes to install backdoors into every Microsoft computer in America through an IME backdoor, and that has actually been proven by the NSA, and this video will probably now be taken off of YouTube. But I think it's very important that people know that. So, getting on. So this will basically give us a human 2.0, which will give us the power to edit life, and the nanobots will give us the power to repair it from within. But what if we combine both? Are we ready to become something more than human? If we think about all this that I have just discussed, should we even cure all disease? Do you want evil people running around forever? But at the same time, who gets to decide who gets the nanobots and who doesn't? Is that the next step in human evolution? And if it is, then we have to make some very important decisions about who's going to get the nanobots and who won't. But once again, brings us back to the moral and ethical dilemma of who makes these types of decisions. And at this point, would humans even be human anymore? Or would they just be AIs? If we can download information in a matter of seconds, and we don't need to learn a new language because we have devices that can translate between our language and another person's language in a matter of seconds, then what truly separates us from AI at that point? So this has been my theoretical ranting on what I think about biomedical engineering and the possibility of ending all disease forever with scientific evidence. Well, I didn't really present the evidence, but there is, this is all backed up by science, and that's interesting. Now, that's the point. Non-human humans, not God's creation, beware. And on that note, thank you for coming to hang out. Thank you, James, for chatting with me and staying in the chat. Hope you have a better night. Sorry about, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be cheesy, but I just don't really believe there's anything I can say that will make you feel better, but I do, send my condolences. So I hope you feel better. And with that, this is the end of the show. Thank you all for coming to hang out. We will see you next time. And as always, why be boring when you can be uncanny? Thank you and have a good night.